Ancient winters in medieval times were absolutely brutal. Picture yourself waking up in a small, cramped hut made of sticks and mud, with frost coating the inside walls. The fire that kept your family warm through the night has died to mere embers, and your breath creates clouds in the frigid air. Outside, snow has piled against your door, and the wind howls through every crack in your shelter. For medieval peasants, winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a life or death struggle that lasted for months. Most people lived in single-room dwellings with their livestock, sharing body heat with cows and pigs just to survive the bone-chilling cold. The floors were packed dirt covered with straw, and windows were nothing more than holes in the wall covered with animal skins or wooden shutters. Food became dangerously scarce during these harsh months. Families survived on whatever they had managed to preserve from the autumn harvest: salted meat that had turned rock hard, bread made from grain mixed with sawdust or ground acorns, and thin, watery soup made from whatever vegetables hadn't rotted. Many people went to bed hungry every night, their stomachs cramping from lack of food. The cold was so intense that water would freeze solid in containers, making even basic hygiene impossible. People wore the same clothes for months without washing them, layering every piece of fabric they owned just to stay warm. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed countless lives, especially among the elderly and children, but perhaps most terrifying was the isolation. When blizzards struck, entire villages could be cut off from the outside world for weeks. Families huddled together in their dark, smoky huts, praying that their meagre supplies would last until spring. The psychological toll was enormous. Months of darkness, cold, and hunger drove many people to desperation. Death stalked every medieval winter. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Pneumonia, influenza, and other respiratory illnesses swept through communities, claiming lives left and right. Graveyards filled faster than graves could be dug in the frozen ground. The wealthy nobles in their stone castles fared somewhat better, but even they struggled with the brutal cold. Castle walls were thick but poorly insulated, and heating an entire fortress was nearly impossible. Even kings and queens shivered through winter nights, wearing furs and huddling close to massive fireplaces that barely warmed a single room. For peasants working outdoors, winter labor was pure torture. They had to care for animals, chop wood, and maintain their homes in conditions that would send modern people straight to the hospital. Their hands became so cold they could barely grip tools, yet the work never stopped, because stopping meant death. These medieval winters were so harsh that they shaped entire cultures. Communities developed elaborate rituals and celebrations just to maintain hope during the darkest months. The promise of spring became almost religious in its importance, as people literally lived or died based on whether they could survive until the snow melted. When we complain about our heating bills or scraping ice off our car windows, we should remember these medieval ancestors who endured months of suffering that would break most modern people in a matter of days. Their winters weren't just cold. They were a brutal test of human endurance that claimed countless lives and left deep scars on those lucky enough to survive. The brutal winters of medieval Europe were not merely inconvenient. They were harbingers of death that transformed entire landscapes into frozen wastelands, where survival became a daily battle against nature's most unforgiving forces. As autumn's final leaves surrendered to the wind, a collective dread settled over medieval villages like a shroud. The approaching winter meant more than just cold weather. It signaled months of potential starvation, disease, and death. Peasants would huddle in their one-room hovels, watching their meagre food stores dwindle while temperatures plummeted to bone-chilling depths that modern heating systems have made us forget ever existed. Picture, if you will, a typical medieval cottage in the depths of January. The walls, constructed of wattle and daub, offered little more protection than a paper barrier against the howling winds. Ice formed on the inside of windows, if there were windows at all. Most peasants made do with simple shutters that, when closed, plunged their homes into perpetual darkness. The only source of warmth came from a central hearth that consumed precious firewood faster than most families could gather it. The cold was so severe that it penetrated every aspect of daily life. Water froze solid in buckets overnight, forcing people to break through thick layers of ice each morning just to access drinking water. Livestock, crammed into the same living spaces as their human owners, provided some warmth through shared body heat. But this arrangement came with its own horrors: the stench of animal waste, the constant noise, and the very real danger of disease transmission. Food preservation became a matter of life and death. Without refrigeration, families relied on smoking, salting, and drying to preserve what little meat they could obtain. But even these methods often failed in the extreme cold, as salt became less effective and smoking fires were difficult to maintain. Vegetables stored in root cellars would freeze and rot, leaving families with nothing but mouldy grain to sustain them through the worst months. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. Medieval winters seemed to stretch endlessly, with daylight hours shrinking to mere glimpses of grey sky between long dark nights. Seasonal depression, though not understood at the time, ravaged communities as people became increasingly isolated and desperate. Some villages would lose contact with the outside world entirely, cut off by impassable snowdrifts and frozen rivers. Children and the elderly suffered most acutely. Their bodies, less capable of generating and retaining heat, succumbed to hypothermia and frostbite at alarming rates. Medieval chronicles record entire families found frozen in their beds, having burned their last pieces of furniture in a futile attempt to stay warm. The very young often didn't survive their first winter, while the old simply gave up, too weak to continue fighting against the relentless cold. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the way winter amplified every other medieval hardship. Disease spread more rapidly in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces, where people huddled together for warmth. Pneumonia and influenza became death sentences for the malnourished and weak. The infamous Black Death found winter conditions particularly favourable, as people remained indoors with infected family members, unable to escape the close quarters that facilitated transmission. Even the wealthy, insulated by their stone castles and vast resources, could not entirely escape winter's wrath. Castle walls, while imposing, were notoriously difficult to heat effectively. Massive fireplaces consumed enormous quantities of wood, yet their heat rarely extended beyond a few feet. Nobles would retreat to smaller chambers, hanging heavy tapestries and furs in desperate attempts to create warm microclimates within their vast, echoing halls. The daily struggle for survival during these brutal winters shaped medieval culture in profound ways. Winter became associated with death, judgment, and divine punishment in the collective consciousness. Religious festivals during the darkest months took on special significance as communities gathered to share dwindling resources and find comfort in shared faith. The promise of spring became more than just a seasonal change. It represented resurrection, hope, and the triumph of life over death. For those who managed to survive these ordeals by ice and snow, the experience left permanent marks. Medieval winter survivors often bore the physical scars of frostbite, missing fingers, toes, or patches of blackened skin that served as constant reminders of their battle against the cold. More importantly, they carried psychological scars that influenced their approach to life, making them acutely aware of their vulnerability and the precious nature of warmth, food, and shelter. These winters were so severe that they influenced military campaigns, trade routes, and political decisions. Armies would avoid winter warfare whenever possible, knowing that the cold could decimate their ranks more effectively than any enemy. Trade ground to a halt as rivers froze and roads became impassable. Even the mighty Roman Empire, at the height of its power, struggled to maintain its northern frontiers during the harsh winter months. The brutality of medieval winters created a culture of incredible resilience and community cooperation. Neighbours would share resources, pool firewood, and take turns keeping watch through the long, dangerous nights. These survival networks became the foundation of medieval social structures, binding communities together through shared hardship and mutual dependence. As we drift off to sleep in our heated homes, it's worth remembering these forgotten heroes of winter survival, the millions of medieval people who faced nature's most brutal season with nothing but their determination, their faith, and each other. Their struggles remind us not only of how far human civilization has progressed, but also of the incredible strength of the human spirit when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges. But perhaps no aspect of medieval life was more brutal than the long, harsh winters that seemed to stretch endlessly across the land. For the peasants huddled in their crude dwellings, winter was not merely a season, but a test of survival that claimed countless lives year after year. As autumn's last harvest was gathered, and the first bitter winds began to whistle through the villages, the peasants knew that the most dangerous months lay ahead. Their homes, if they could even be called that, offered little protection against the relentless cold. These were simple structures of wattle and daub, with walls made from woven sticks plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The thatched roofs, while providing some shelter from rain and snow, were poor insulators that allowed precious heat to escape into the frigid air above. Inside these cramped quarters, entire families would huddle together for warmth, often sharing their living space with their livestock. Cows, pigs, and chickens were brought indoors, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. The animals provided additional body heat, and their presence meant the difference between life and death on the coldest nights. The mingled breath of humans and beasts created a constant fog in the dim interior, while the acrid smoke from the central hearth stung their eyes and filled their lungs. The challenge of staying warm was matched only by the difficulty of finding enough food to sustain life through the winter months. The harvest stores that had seemed adequate in autumn dwindled with alarming speed as the weeks wore on. Families rationed their meager supplies with mathematical precision, knowing that a miscalculation could mean starvation before spring's return. Preserved foods dominated the winter diet, but preservation techniques were crude and often unreliable. Salt pork, if a family was fortunate enough to possess any, was precious beyond measure. More commonly, peasants subsisted on dried grains made into thin gruel, supplemented by whatever vegetables they had managed to store in root cellars or preserve in brine. The monotony of this diet was broken only by the occasional luxury of dried fish or the rare treat of cheese that had not yet spoiled. Water, that most basic necessity of life, became a daily struggle when streams and wells froze solid. Peasants would chip away at ice with crude tools, gathering chunks to melt over their fires. This process consumed precious fuel and time, both of which were in desperately short supply. Some families resorted to melting snow, though this yielded little water and required constant tending of the fire. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was genuinely life-threatening. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency, leaving survivors maimed and unable to work effectively when spring finally arrived. Hypothermia stalked the weak and elderly, and many simply did not wake from their sleep on the coldest nights. Children, with their smaller bodies and higher metabolic needs, were particularly vulnerable. Infant mortality rates soared during the winter months, adding grief to the already overwhelming burden of survival. Perhaps most terrifying of all was the constant threat of illness. In the close, poorly ventilated quarters where families sheltered, disease spread with frightening speed. Pneumonia and influenza, conditions that might be manageable in better circumstances, became death sentences for those already weakened by cold and malnutrition. The lack of medical knowledge meant that families could only watch helplessly as loved ones succumbed to ailments that seemed to strike without warning or mercy. Even the wealthy faced significant challenges during medieval winters, though their struggles pale in comparison to those of the peasantry. The great stone castles of the nobility, impressive though they were notoriously difficult to heat. Massive fireplaces consumed enormous quantities of wood, yet their heat barely penetrated the vast, drafty halls. Noble families might retreat to smaller chambers during the worst weather, hanging tapestries to block drafts and huddling around braziers filled with glowing coals. For those whose work took them outdoors, winter was a particular form of hell. Shepherds continuing to tend their flocks faced exposure that could kill within hours. Guards, walking the walls of castles and fortifications, wrapped themselves in layer upon layer of wool and fur, yet still suffered from the biting wind and snow. Merchants brave enough to attempt winter travel risked not only the dangers of bandits and wolves, but also the very real possibility of becoming lost in blizzards and freezing to death far from any shelter. The psychological toll of these harsh winters cannot be underestimated. The combination of physical discomfort, constant hunger, and the ever-present threat of death created a pervasive atmosphere of dread that settled over communities like a suffocating blanket. Seasonal depression, though not understood in modern terms, was a very real phenomenon that affected countless individuals. The shortening days and long nights seemed to drain the life from people, leaving them listless and despairing. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming hardship, medieval people found ways to cope and even to find moments of warmth and joy. Families drew closer together, literally and figuratively, as they shared body heat and stories around the hearth. Religious observances took on special significance during these dark months, offering hope for divine protection and the promise of eventual spring. The celebration of Christmas and other winter festivals provided brief but precious respites from the gloom, times when communities came together to share what little they had and to remind themselves that they were not alone in their struggles. The long winter nights were filled with storytelling, as generations passed down tales of heroes and adventures, of better times and distant lands where the sun always shone. These stories served not merely as entertainment, but as vital psychological sustenance that helped people endure until dawn. Mothers would sing lullabies to their children, their voices carrying across the cramped quarters and offering comfort to all who heard them. When spring finally arrived, it was greeted with an explosion of relief and gratitude that we can barely imagine today. The first green shoots pushing through the thawing earth were signs of salvation, proof that the world had not ended, despite all appearances to the contrary. Families would emerge from their winter shelters like bears awakening from hibernation, blinking in the strengthening sunlight and marveling at their own survival. These brutal medieval winters shaped more than just individual lives. They profoundly influenced the culture and worldview of entire societies. The constant awareness of winter's approach affected everything from military campaigns to trade negotiations. Armies avoided winter battles whenever possible, knowing that the cold could be a more deadly enemy than any human foe. Merchants planned their routes and schedules around the seasons, understanding that winter travel was often impossible and always dangerous. The experience of surviving these harsh winters also fostered a deep sense of community solidarity that was essential to medieval life. Neighbours checked on one another during the worst weather, sharing fuel, food, and warmth when possible. The knowledge that everyone faced the same struggles created bonds of mutual dependence that transcended normal social boundaries. Even the most selfish individuals understood that community survival often meant individual survival. These shared experiences of hardship also reinforced religious faith and practices. The helplessness that people felt in the face of winter's onslaught drove them to seek divine intervention and protection. Churches became not just places of worship, but also community centres where people gathered for warmth and mutual support. The clergy played crucial roles in organising relief efforts and providing both spiritual and practical comfort to their flocks. The constant threat of winter starvation also influenced medieval attitudes toward food and hospitality. The sharing of meals took on almost sacred significance as people understood that today's generosity might be repaid with life-saving assistance when the roles were reversed. The concept of hospitality to strangers was deeply ingrained in medieval culture, partly because everyone understood how quickly circumstances could change and how desperately help might be needed. For those who survived multiple brutal winters, the experience left lasting physical and psychological scars. Malnutrition during childhood affected growth and development, creating generations of people who bore the permanent marks of their harsh upbringing. The constant stress of survival also aged people prematurely, contributing to the notably short life expectancy of the medieval period. The cumulative effect of these winter experiences also shaped medieval literature, art, and folklore. The contrast between the warmth and plenty of summer and the cold desperation of winter became a central metaphor in countless works. The cycle of death and rebirth that winter represented influenced religious thought and seasonal celebrations. Even the architecture of the period reflected the paramount importance of surviving winter, with features designed to conserve heat and protect against the elements. As we consider these accounts of medieval winters, we gain insight into the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Despite facing conditions that would challenge even our modern survival techniques, medieval people not only endured, but also created rich cultures, built lasting institutions, and raised families with love and hope for the future. Their ability to find meaning and even joy in the midst of such hardship speaks to fundamental qualities of human nature that transcend time and circumstance. The story of medieval winters is ultimately a story of survival against overwhelming odds, of communities pulling together in the face of mortal danger, and of the deep human capacity to endure suffering while still maintaining hope for better days ahead. In their struggle against the cold and darkness, medieval people demonstrated that the human spirit, like the promise of spring, can survive even the harshest of winters. But for most medieval peasants, there was no escape from this relentless cycle of hardship and hunger. Food preservation was a constant battle against time and nature. Without refrigeration or modern preservation methods, families faced the terrifying prospect of starvation as winter approached. The techniques available to them were crude but essential for survival. Salt was perhaps the most precious commodity for preservation, worth its weight in silver to those who could afford it. Peasants would pack their meagre portions of meat in coarse salt, drawing out moisture to prevent rot. The process was laborious and expensive, requiring careful rationing of both salt and sustenance. A single mistake in the curing process could mean the loss of an entire winter's protein supply. Smoking offered another method of preservation, though it required constant vigilance. Families would construct makeshift smokehouses from whatever materials they could gather, feeding fires with aromatic woods that would slowly dehydrate their precious stores of fish and meat. The acrid smoke would sting their eyes and coat their lungs, but it meant the difference between survival and starvation in the harsh months ahead. Root cellars carved deep into the earth provided natural refrigeration for vegetables and grains. These underground chambers, lined with stones and packed with straw, maintained a consistent cool temperature that could extend the life of stored food by months. Peasants would carefully layer their harvested turnips, onions and cabbages in these earthen vaults, checking regularly for signs of rot that could spread and destroy their entire winter supply. The process of making cheese became an art of necessity rather than luxury. Peasant women would carefully tend to their few precious cows or goats, transforming fresh milk into wheels of hard cheese that could last through the darkest months. The process required precise timing and temperature control, skills passed down from mother to daughter through generations of hardship. Even bread, the staff of life, required careful preservation techniques. Peasants would bake large, dense loaves designed to last for weeks rather than days. These brick-hard rounds bore little resemblance to the soft, fresh bread we know today, but they provided essential calories when fresh food was nothing but a distant memory. Perhaps most challenging of all was the preservation of fruits and vegetables. Without sugar for proper preservation, peasants relied on drying techniques that concentrated flavors while extending shelf life. Apples would be sliced thin and hung in drafty spaces to slowly dehydrate. Cabbage would be shredded and fermented into sauerkraut, creating a tangy, vitamin-rich food that could survive the winter months. The wealthy, of course, had access to exotic preservation methods that remained far beyond the reach of common folk. Honey, imported spices, and specially constructed ice houses allowed the nobility to enjoy a variety of preserved foods that would have seemed magical to the average peasant. These luxuries served as constant reminders of the vast gulf between the haves and have-nots in medieval society. Yet even with all these preservation techniques, failure was common and catastrophic. A wet summer could ruin grain stores before they could be properly dried. Mice and rats could devastate carefully hoarded supplies in a single night. Mold could spread through root cellars like wildfire, destroying months of careful preparation in days. The psychological toll of this constant uncertainty cannot be overstated. Medieval peasants lived with the knowledge that their survival hung by the thinnest of threads, dependent on their skill in preservation and the mercy of nature. The anxiety of watching stored food supplies dwindle as winter deepened was a burden shared by entire communities. This precarious relationship with food preservation shaped not just what medieval people ate, but how they lived, worked, and planned for the future. Every harvest brought both relief and anxiety, as families rushed to process and store their bounty before time and nature could claim it. The successful preservation of food was literally a matter of life and death, making these ancient techniques far more than mere culinary curiosities, but essential survival skills that sustained civilization through its darkest hours. As we drift off to sleep in our modern world of abundant fresh food and reliable refrigeration, we can hardly imagine the daily anxiety and backbreaking labor that food preservation required of our ancestors. Their ingenuity and perseverance in the face of such challenges reminds us to be grateful for the simple miracle of opening a refrigerator and finding fresh food waiting for us, preserved not by salt and smoke and constant worry, but by the marvels of modern technology that have freed us from winter's ancient tyranny. As winter approached in medieval times, the countryside would transform into a frozen wasteland that tested the very limits of human endurance. By November, the first bitter winds would begin to sweep across the fields, carrying with them the promise of months of unrelenting cold and darkness ahead. The peasants who had toiled through the summer and autumn months now faced their greatest challenge: surviving the brutal medieval winter with whatever meagre provisions they had managed to store away. For most, this meant existing on the edge of starvation for 4 to 5 months, huddled in drafty hovels that offered little protection from the elements. The arrival of winter was not gradual, but sudden and merciless. Overnight, the temperature could plummet below freezing, turning the muddy village paths into treacherous sheets of ice. The wind would howl through the gaps in poorly constructed walls, extinguishing precious candles and making sleep nearly impossible. Children would wake to find their breath visible in the frigid air, and water left in bowls would be frozen solid by morning. For the medieval peasant family, winter preparations began in late autumn, with a desperate scramble to gather whatever fuel they could find. Wood was scarce and jealously guarded by the lord of the manor, so most families had to make do with dry dung, straw, and whatever fallen branches they could scavenge from the forest floor. These meagre fuel supplies would have to last until spring, forcing families to ration their warmth as carefully as their food. The preservation of food became a matter of life and death. Throughout the autumn months, peasant women would work tirelessly to salt meat, dry vegetables, and ferment whatever grains they could spare. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips would be buried in underground pits, covered with straw and earth to prevent them from freezing. Barrels of ale and cider, often the only safe beverages available, would be stored in the coldest corners of the house to prevent spoilage. But even with these preparations, most families faced the grim reality that their stores would run dangerously low before spring arrived. By February, many households would be reduced to eating what medieval chroniclers called famine bread, a nauseating mixture of bark, sawdust, and whatever grain remained, ground together and baked into loaves that barely qualified as food. The psychological toll of medieval winters was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. Trapped indoors for months at a time, entire families would huddle together in single rooms, sharing their space with livestock brought inside for warmth. The constant smell of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and smoke from poorly ventilated fires created an oppressive atmosphere that wore down even the strongest spirits. Depression and despair were common during these dark months, though medieval people had no understanding of what we now call seasonal affective disorder. They simply knew that as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, many villagers would fall into deep melancholy. Some would refuse to eat what little food was available, while others would become violent and unpredictable. The village priest would often be the only source of comfort during these bleak months, offering prayers and the promise of salvation to families whose faith was tested by unrelenting suffering. Churches, with their thick stone walls and larger fireplaces, became gathering places where the community could share body heat and find temporary respite from the cold. Children were particularly vulnerable during medieval winters. Their small bodies could not generate enough heat to survive in the frigid conditions, and many would succumb to what we now know as hypothermia. Medieval parents would wrap their children in every available scrap of cloth and keep them as close to the fire as possible. But even these measures often proved insufficient. The clothing available to medieval peasants provided little protection against the cold. Most garments were made from coarse wool or linen that became stiff and uncomfortable when wet. Shoes, if they existed at all, were often little more than pieces of leather tied around the feet with string. Frostbite was so common that losing fingers or toes to the cold was considered a normal part of winter survival. Medical knowledge during the medieval period was primitive at best, and winter illnesses often proved fatal. The combination of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and constant exposure to cold created perfect conditions for disease to spread rapidly through communities. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and various fevers would sweep through villages, claiming the lives of the young, old, and weak. The wealthy nobility fared somewhat better during winter months, but even they faced significant hardships. Medieval castles, despite their impressive stone walls, were notoriously difficult to heat. The great halls with their soaring ceilings were nearly impossible to warm, and even the lord's private chambers remained uncomfortably cold throughout the winter months. Noble families would retreat to smaller rooms during the coldest weather, hanging heavy tapestries on the walls to provide additional insulation. They had access to better food stores and more fuel for their fires, but they were not immune to the diseases and dangers that winter brought. Many nobles would travel to warmer climates during the worst months, leaving their estates in the hands of stewards and servants. The contrast between rich and poor was never more stark than during winter. While peasants gnawed on frozen turnips and bark bread, noble tables still groaned under the weight of preserved meats, imported wines, and exotic spices. This inequality bred resentment that would sometimes boil over into violence when spring finally arrived. Outdoor work during medieval winters was extremely dangerous and often deadly. Farmers still needed to tend to their animals, even in the worst weather. Shepherds would venture out into blizzards to rescue trapped sheep, often becoming lost themselves in the swirling snow. Many would be found days later, frozen to death, just yards from safety. The simple act of drawing water from wells became a daily struggle during winter months. Wells would freeze over, requiring families to break through thick ice to reach the water below. The metal buckets would burn unprotected hands, and the water would begin to freeze again before it could be carried back to the house. Cooking became nearly impossible during the coldest weather. The precious fuel needed to be conserved for warmth, so families would often eat cold, partially cooked meals. Bread would freeze solid and need to be thawed by the fire before it could be eaten. Ale would turn to slush, and even the fat used for cooking would solidify into unusable chunks. The arrival of winter also brought unique dangers that modern people rarely consider. Wolves, driven by hunger, would venture closer to human settlements in search of food. Families would barricade their doors at night and listen in terror to the howling of packs just outside their walls. Livestock brought indoors were often the wolves' primary targets, but there are documented cases of these desperate predators attacking humans as well. Travel during medieval winters was extremely treacherous and usually avoided except in cases of dire emergency. Roads would become impassable rivers of mud and ice, and travelers caught in sudden storms would often perish from exposure. Even short journeys between villages could become death sentences if the weather turned bad unexpectedly. The few brave souls who did venture out during winter months would wrap themselves in every available layer of clothing and carry emergency supplies of food and fuel. They would travel in groups when possible, knowing that a single misstep or moment of bad luck could leave them stranded in deadly conditions. Despite all these hardships, medieval communities developed remarkable strategies for survival that demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit. Neighbours would share resources during the worst periods, pooling their meagre supplies to help everyone survive until spring. Communal cooking arrangements would allow families to conserve fuel while still preparing warm meals. Storytelling became a crucial survival tool during the long winter nights. Families would gather around their fires and share tales of heroes, monsters, and distant lands. These stories served not only as entertainment, but as a way to preserve cultural knowledge and maintain morale during the darkest months. Religious festivals and celebrations took on special significance during medieval winters, providing desperately needed breaks from the monotony and despair. Christmas, with its promise of feasting and gift-giving, offered hope even to the poorest families. The 12 days of Christmas celebration were often the only time during winter when people could indulge in better food and drink. The Feast of Candlemas in February marked the midpoint of winter and was celebrated with particular enthusiasm. People would light every candle they possessed, filling their homes with warm light that symbolized the eventual return of spring. These celebrations were more than mere tradition. They were psychological necessities that helped people endure conditions that would break the spirit of many modern individuals. Medieval winters also fostered innovation and creativity born of desperation. Families would huddle together and engage in handicrafts that could be completed by firelight. Women would spin wool and weave cloth, while men would carve tools and repair equipment. These activities not only provided useful items, but also helped pass the endless hours of confinement. Children learned to entertain themselves with simple games and toys made from scraps of wood and cloth. They would create elaborate fantasy worlds in their imaginations, often centered around the promise of spring's return and the abundance it would bring. The end of winter was marked not by a specific date, by subtle signs that experienced villagers learned to recognize. The first tentative chirping of birds, the slight lengthening of days, and the gradual softening of frozen ground all signaled that the worst was finally over. When spring finally arrived, it was met with celebrations that rivaled any religious festival. Communities would gather to share their relief and joy, often consuming the last of their winter stores in elaborate feasts. The survivors would look back on another winter endured and forward to the promise of warmth, growth, and renewal that lay ahead. The legacy of these brutal medieval winters shaped European culture in ways that persist to this day. The emphasis on community cooperation, the importance of careful planning and resource management, and the deep appreciation for simple comforts all trace their roots back to those dark months when survival itself was never guaranteed. For the medieval peasant, winter was not merely a season, but a test of character, endurance, and faith. Those who survived did so through a combination of careful preparation, community support, and sheer determination. Their stories of triumph over seemingly impossible conditions continue to inspire us today, reminding us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit when faced with nature's most brutal challenges. In studying these harsh realities of medieval winter survival, we gain not only historical knowledge, but also perspective on our own modern comforts and conveniences. The next time you adjust your thermostat or open your well-stocked refrigerator, spare a thought for those brave souls who faced the winter darkness with nothing but their courage, their community, and their unshakable belief that spring would come again.